But finally, some good news for consumers. You can breathe a little sigh of relief, just a little one, and don't hold your breath too long because it might change again. But inflation easing in July, dropping to 4.7% from 5.4% in June. It's actually quite a significant drop. When you take a look at the cost of living at the moment, we'll take what we can. If I understand correctly, this is the lowest level in 2 years. But the good news is, an expectation, Dawie Roodt, economist, making time for me this morning, is that this is possibly going to stop the Reserve Bank from releasing the Phala Phala report. That's going to stop them reducing and increasing the interest rates, isn't it? Good morning. We'll get to Phala Phala in a second. Let's talk interest rates. Is it going to come down, stay the same?
Good morning to you. This was an excellent number, really. 4.7% increase in inflation rate. Just remember, it doesn't mean prices are coming down. It means that prices are still going up, but at a slower rate. And in the case of food prices, for example, that is still going up at quite a significant rate, nearly 10%, but at least slower than previously. But it's a much better figure than what I've expected, 4.7%. But I have to warn that there are some other price increases that have to work themselves through the economy. Like for example, the price increase in diesel and petrol that we've just had, that will be reflected in 2 months' time, for example, and that will push inflation up again. But where we have inflation now is very important because it is 4.7% is very close to that midpoint of the inflation targeted band of the South African Reserve Bank, 3 to 6%, and that's exactly where the Reserve Bank wants inflation. So we have to anchor inflation at these kinds of levels. And I think the Reserve Bank will come out and tell us that, make a lot of noise and tell us that you guys better behave, or I'm going to increase interest rates, but I don't think they're going to increase interest rates again. I think where they have interest rates at the moment, 8.25% on the repo rate, and where we have inflation at the moment, that is exactly where we want it, and that's a so-called sweet spot. In fact, I think if inflation remains where it is, and maybe by the end of the year start drifting a little bit lower, there's a possibility of a rate cut by the end of this year or early next year.
I'm trying to imagine the days, back in the day, as the kids say, when last we had an interest rate reduction. Imagine the day and the celebrations and the champagne will be decorked when that actually takes place. So that's the what of the situation, Dawie. That's what the numbers are. Help me understand, why has this happened? I'm sure it's probably macro and micro, but for the economic idiot like myself, how has this happened?
Well, there are a number of factors contributing to this, and I can unpack the numbers and I can tell you food prices increased by so much, electricity prices increased by so much, and energy prices and so on. But there's another factor that is very important, and that is so-called base factors. Economists always refer to base factors. Now, what we had last year is an increase in the inflation rate. And remember, inflation is usually calculated from 1 year to the next year. So from this year to compared to a year ago, exactly a year ago. So if a year ago was relatively high, the inflation rate a year ago, then purely technically, inflation is likely to drift lower as well. So when we have very volatile inflation like what we've had recently, that result in let's call it a volatile base as well. And that means that inflation can suddenly go up or down based simply on the way that it is calculated. But maybe something else that is also important to note here is that we have interest rates, or the repo rate, at 8.25% at the moment. We have inflation below 5% now, which means that the so-called real interest rate is in the region of about 3% or slightly more than 3%. And that means that South Africa's interest rates actually went up in real terms now that the inflation rate went down, because you have to subtract inflation from the interest rates. And that, in a way, is the reason why the rand suddenly strengthened.
Yeah.
Because you want to support your currency, you increase interest rates. But what just has happened is that because inflation came lower, our interest rates, in a way, went up. And that's the reason why the rand appreciated very, very nicely. And a stronger rand in itself will also contribute to lower inflation going forward. Very good set of numbers.
Some good numbers as far as the rand was concerned. 18.47 at intraday trading yesterday as well, dropping a little bit at the close, but still good numbers for the past couple of days. Something else I want to talk to you about, Dawie, and I've seen a lot of reaction to this, and I'm sure you can weigh in on this for me. I need to talk about this Phala Phala and the South African Reserve Bank. I'm not going to call it a report. I'm going to call it a summary, because they're not going to release the report. They're not going to give the details of the investigation into the money that the president received. And I want to use my words very carefully here, because the money that the president received in return for the cattle, that was back in 2020, I'm sorry. There's a big problem here around the possession versus the ownership of the money and something called a perfected transaction. Help me understand what I'm talking about, because this seems to be the gray area that no one understands.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say that I always try to defend the Reserve Bank. I think Lesetja Kganyago is doing an excellent job when it comes to monetary policy. The Reserve Bank sometimes makes very unpopular decisions by increasing interest rates, and I'm a great fan of the Reserve Bank. I think the Reserve Bank made a big mistake here. I think this is a cover-up, and I think it is wrong. Basically, what happened here is that somebody we know who was in possession of this, but somebody was the owner of $850,000 in South Africa, and that person was in contravention of the foreign exchange regulations in South Africa. Who that person is, I do not know. The Reserve Bank reckons it is not the president, then somebody else must be in contravention of the foreign exchange regulations. My feeling is that it was the president, although he was not the owner of the money, but he was certainly in possession of the money, or at least his people or his company was in possession of the money. And I'm afraid to say, the Reserve Bank, I always supported the Reserve Bank, but on this one, I think this was a cover-up.
And I want to unpack, just so we can all understand what we're talking about. I'm going to use you and I as a scenario here, Dawie, and tell me if I've got this wrong. Like a good economics lecturer, interrupt me if I'm getting this wrong. Let's talk about possession, ownership of the money, and a perfected transaction. I have some paintings. Dawie Roodt wants to buy some paintings from Gareth Edwards for R1 million. Let's make up a number, R1 million. You come to my house, you give me R1 million for the paintings, but I don't give you the paintings as yet, but I've got your money.
It is not relevant. It is actually not relevant. So the point you want to make is that the transaction happened, and you got the paintings, I got the money, so therefore I'm in the possession, and I'm the owner of the money, you're the owner of the paintings. That is the excuse of the Reserve Bank, that this transaction was not concluded. That is not relevant. What is relevant? Somebody was in possession of the money, and that is illegal. You are not allowed to be in possession of foreign exchange in South Africa unless you jump through a couple of hoops. I think like I've said, I think this was simply a cover-up. The president came off very, very lightly.